The Life of Dwight L. Moody, Chapter 6, being read by Peter John Parisi, also known as Brian Dean. Giving up business. The greatest struggle I ever had in my life is when I gave up business, Mr. Moody often said. The steadily increasing duties in my pioneer religious work had not prevented his success in business, and though manager of the largest Sunday school in the country, he could hold this position without detriment to the interests of his employer. In 1858, he entered the establishment of C.N. Henderson, a wholesale boot and shoe dealer, where he worked on commission. This gave him greater freedom to use a part of his time in Christian work without encroaching upon his employer's right. His warm esteem for his employer, whose friendship he thoroughly appreciated, is shown in the following extract from a letter to his mother written January 2, 1859. On my return from the country last week, I found my hopes all vanquished. The one to whom I looked for advice and counsel, who had proved to be more than a friend to me, was dead. The man was my employer, Mr. Henderson. I shall miss him very much. He was the truest friend I have met since I left home. He seemed to take as much an interest in my welfare as he would in the welfare of his own son. That this feeling was fully reciprocated is indicated by the fact that a year later, Mrs. Henderson insisted on Moody's settling up her husband's business. A young man of 23 years, he shrank from the responsibility of handling an estate worth $150,000. But I feel greatly honored, he wrote his mother, for they had a great many friends who are good businessmen. I never have been put in so responsible a position in my life, and my prayer is that I will do myself credit. Do not say anything about this, will you? I am in hopes that you will not forget to pray for me, for I am nothing without the same God, who has been with me since I started out in life. About this time he was actively connected with a congregational church on the north side. The meetings were too slow for Moody, and he went to some good brother and asked him at the next meeting if he would get up and be the first to speak. He said he would. Mr. Moody then went to others and engaged 3 to be second speaker and 3 others to be third. When the first man had spoken, the others followed, several rising at once. This unusual sight inspired the meeting with the enthusiasm of a revival, and was really the beginning of a great quickening of spiritual interest in the church. In 1860, he was working for Bew, Hill, and Granger, and had saved $7,000 towards the $100,000 which had been his early ambition. In one single year he made by special commissions, in addition to his regular salary, over $5,000, an unusually large sum for a young man under 24. It was a time of great excitement in the nation. Abraham Lincoln had been nominated and elected president, and like the young men who were his associates, Mr. Moody was immersed in business and politics and keenly alive to all the events of the hour. He had an experience at this time, however, that entirely transformed his career and led him to devote himself exclusively to Christian work. All ambitions for wealth were sacrificed, but not until the struggle had lasted 3 months long. Finally, what he felt to be the call of God was triumphant, and he surrendered his own plans for his father's. How he came to give up business altogether may best be told in his own words. I had never lost sight of Jesus Christ since the first time I met him in the store at Boston, but for years I really believed I could not work for God. No one had ever asked me to do anything. When I went to Chicago, I hired 4 pews in a church and used to go out on the street and pick up young men and fill these pews. I never spoke to the young men about their souls. That was the work of the elders, I thought. After working for some time like that, I started a mission Sunday school. I brought numbers. I thought numbers were everything, and so I worked for numbers. When the attendance ran below 1,000, it troubled me, and when it ran to 12 to 1,500, I was elated. Since none were converted, there was no harvest. Then God opened my eyes. There was a class of young ladies in the school who were, without exception, the most frivolous set of girls I ever met. On Sunday, the teacher was ill, and I took that class. They laughed in my face, and I felt like opening the door and telling them all to go out and never come back. That week, the teacher of the class came into the store where I worked. He was pale and looked very ill. "What is the trouble?" I asked. "I have had another hemorrhage from the lungs. The doctor says I cannot live on Lake Michigan, so I am going back to New York State. I suppose I'm going to die." He seemed greatly troubled, and when I asked the reason, he replied, "Well, I have never led any of my class to Christ. I really believe I have done the girls more harm than good." I had never heard anyone talk like that before, and it set me thinking. After a while I said, "Suppose you go and tell them how you feel. I will go with you in a carriage if you want to go." He consented, and we started out together. It was one of the best journeys I ever had on earth. We went to the house of one of the girls, called for her, and the teacher talked to her about her soul. There was no laughing then. Tears stood in her eyes before long. After he had explained the way of life, he suggested that we have a word of prayer. He asked me to pray. True, I had never done such a thing in my life as to pray God to convert a young lady then and there, but we prayed, and God answered our prayer. We went to other houses. He would go upstairs and be all out of breath, and he would tell the girls what he had come for. It wasn't long before they broke down and sought for salvation. When the strength gave out, I took him back to his lodgings. The next day we went out again. At the end of 10 days, we came to the store, with his face literally shining. "Mr. Moody," he said, "the last one of my class has yielded herself to Christ." I tell you, we had a time of rejoicing. He had to leave the next night, so I called his class together that night for a prayer meeting, and there God kindled a fire in my soul that has never gone out. The height of my ambition had been to be a successful merchant, and if I had known that meeting was going to take that ambition out of me, I might not have gone. But how many times I have thanked God since that meeting. The dying teacher sat in the midst of his class and talked with them and read the 14th chapter of John. We tried to sing, "Blessed be the tie that binds us," but after which we knelt to pray. I was just rising from my knees when one of the class began to pray for her dying teacher. Another prayed, and another, and before we rose, the whole class had prayed. As I went out, I said to myself, "Oh God, let me die rather than lose the blessing I have received tonight." The next evening, I went to the depot to say goodbye to that teacher. Just before the train started, one of the class came, and before long, without any prearrangements, they were all there. What a meeting that was. We tried to sing, but we broke down. The last we saw of that teacher, he was standing on the platform of the rail car, his finger pointing upwards, telling that class to meet him in heaven. Having some saved during his business career, Mr. Moody decided to live on this as long as it lasted. If at the end of this time the Lord continued to reward his labors, thus indicating that it was the right course to continue, he believed that the means for it would be provided. He began to economize at once in every possible manner, leaving his comfortable boarding place with its congenial associates and sleeping in the prayer meeting room at the Young Men's Christian Association. He took his meals in cheap restaurants and lived in a way that would have killed a man of ordinary constitutions. He would often say in later years, speaking of those days, "I was an older man before 30 than I have ever been since. A man's health is too precious to be carelessly neglected as was mine." He now had time to conduct his Sunday school work more systematically and visit his scholars in their homes. This was an adventurous proceeding, for in some of the Roman Catholic families he was anything but a welcome caller. But he persisted fearlessly in the work, and won many a family that at first received his invitations to North Market Hall or his mission hall with the bitterest contempt. In his Christian work, as formerly in business, Moody had little regard for strict conventionalism. That did not appeal to his very practical judgment as useful or effective, and many a strange position did he find himself in when he undertook to secure his object without consideration of what was the regular but less immediate method. Often he would haul children on the street, inviting them to his Sunday school, and would ask an introduction to their parents to secure their consent to the children becoming members. On Sunday afternoon he met a little girl, of whom he inquired where she had attended Sunday school. as she was not a regular attendant anywhere. Moody asked to be introduced to her mother, to secure permission for the family to attend her school. The child had reasons for not wanting to have Mr. Moody find her home, as she knew who he was. Asking him to wait on the corner for her till she had done the errand on which she had been sent, she disappeared, not to return. For 3 hours he waited on the street corner for the little truant before he gave up. For 3 hours he waited on the street corner for the little truant before he gave her up at last. Some days later he found the girl again, and the recognition was mutual. Without waiting to explain why she had deserted him on the former occasion, the child turned and fled. At this time, the city's system of drainage had just been changed, necessitating the elevation by several feet of the streets to a larger portion of the city. In some cases, the property owners had not elevated their houses, but had built new sidewalks on a level with the raised street. In this tradition, period from low to high grade, these innovations had been frequent but irregular, and the connections between old sidewalk levels and new ones were made by a few raised steps. Up and down these sidewalks the girl ran, while close behind her followed the determined Sunday school teacher. Finally she darted into a saloon, and through the bar room into a little room, and finally upstairs, where she found her hiding under a bed. Having persuaded the child to come out, he was duly introduced to the mother, explained the purpose of his call, and the children were secured for the North Market Hall. The sad story of the family was afterwards confided to Mr. Moody, when he learned that the mother was a widow who had only recently lost her husband. She had come to Chicago to make his fortune. He had come to Chicago to make his fortune, and having failed to secure employment at his trade as a carpenter, had finally opened a saloon. Soon after he died, leaving the saloon as the only means of support to his widow and children, who had never become reconciled to the business and felt ashamed of this way of gaining a livelihood. This explained the child's unwillingness to have Mr. Moody know where she lived. In time, the widow and her children were led into a way of a better life. The saloon was closed, and years afterwards Mr. Moody met, in a western city, the little girl who had given him that wild chase, a woman now, the wife of an earnest Christian, and herself devoted to church work. A source of very great annoyance to Mr. Moody in his pioneer Sunday school work at this time was the frequent disturbances which came from the lower class of the Roman Catholic element. Many of the boys would try to interfere with the meetings, broken windows, and such disturbances being not the least troublesome expression of their disapproval. At last he felt that extreme measures must be taken, and he called on Bishop Dunnigan, D-U-G-G-A-N, who was prelate of the diocese. It was not an easy matter to gain access to so high a church dignitary, and a maid who answered his call at the door was not ready to promise him the audience he requested. The bishop, he was told, was very busy and could not be seen, but young Moody had taken the precaution to step over the threshold and was not so easily dwarfed. "Well, never mind," he said. "I will remain until he is at leisure," and without waiting for further invitation, quietly passed into the hallway. The maid was not sure at all that the bishop would care to be interrupted by the self-constituted missionary, but it was useless to attempt to dissuade him. He had come to see the bishop and would wait, if necessary, for the remainder of the day until the bishop could find it convenient to give him a hearing. When at length the bishop appeared in the hall, the young man very briefly related his mission, and said that he was engaged in a work for the children in the part of the city that was being neglected by everybody else. It was therefore a pity, he said, that we should not be allowed to continue the work unmolested, and he requested the bishop to give orders to the parish priest to prevent all further inferences. The bishop refused to believe that any of his people were to blame for the disturbances, to which Moody announced that his own reason for believing that the boys were Roman Catholic was their own statement to the effect. The bishop then replied that they represented the worst element in the church, and that he had no control over them. "Your zeal and devotion are most commendable in behalf of these people, however," he added, "and all you need to make you a great power for good is to come within the fold of the only true church. But, replied the young missionary, whatever advantage that would give me among your people would be offset by the fact that I could no longer work among the Protestants. Well, certainly you could still work among the Protestants, was the reply. But surely you would not let me pray with a Protestant if I became Roman Catholic. Yes, replied the bishop, you could pray with Protestants as much as ever. Well, I didn't know that, said the young man. Would you, Bishop, pray with a Protestant? Yes, said the bishop, I would. Well then, replied Mr. Moody, I wish that you would pray for me now, that I may be led aright in this matter, and forthwith knelt where he had been standing in the hall. The bishop and Mr. Moody both prayed. The result of the short conference was a ceasing from all further annoyances from the Roman Catholic element in that day, and a lifelong friendship between the two men. But his efforts were not always attended with such immediate success. A man does not gain the strength to conquer others in a series of rapid victories alone, and often the result of his most earnest work was apparently little or nothing. On his way home from meeting one night, Mr. Moody saw a man leaning against a lamppost. Stepping up to him and placing his hands on his shoulders, he said, "Are you a Christian?" The man flew into a rage, doubled up his fist, and it seemed for a moment as if the missionary might be pitched into the gutter. "I'm very sorry if I have offended you," said Mr. Moody. "Mind your own business," roared the man. "That is my business," the other replied quietly, and went on his way. About 3 months later, on a bitter cold morning at daybreak, someone knocked at Mr. Moody's door. "Who's there?" he asked. A strange voice answered, and he said, "What do you want?" "I want to become a Christian," was the reply. Mr. Moody opened the door, and to his astonishment, there was the man who had cursed him for talking to him as he leaned against the lamppost. "I'm very sorry," said the man. "I haven't had any peace since that night. Your words have haunted and troubled me. I couldn't sleep last night, and I thought I would come and get you to pray for me." That man accepted Christ, and the moment he had done so asked, "What can I do for him?" He taught in the Sabbath school until the war broke out, when he enlisted and was one of the first to be shot down, but not before he had given his testimony for God.